I'd like to hand over to Professor Ken Catchpole.
Thank you. I work in almost, in fact, exclusively in healthcare because that's where my passions lie, and it's the thing I love to do and the expertise that I've developed. But these things can apply much more broadly than that. The nice thing about human factors is, or one of the things about human factors is it's a way of thinking. Sometimes I was like, well, what is it we do? Well, there are a bunch of tools that we can apply, but actually there's a way of thinking that it's about, which is about systems thinking, and from the perspective of placing the importance of humans at the center of the system. So it's about understanding interactions among humans and other elements of a system, and that system might be, we can kind of call it anything. If you like, sometimes thinking about context rather than systems helps. In order to optimize human well-being and overall system performance. So the idea here is that we can't necessarily separate humans from the world around us, and that the context in which we find ourselves often invisibly guides our, or visibly guides our behaviors in certain ways. And so we can use this to design the world in all sorts of different ways to achieve the effects that we want to achieve. Whether that's designing signage or architecture to guide people to walk in certain directions and with certain flows, or whether it's to design devices that are easy and fault-free to use, or procedures that make it easy to do the right thing and difficult to do the wrong thing. It comes from where it sort of comes into its own. It originates in things like scientific management from the early 1900s, sort of time and motion studies of bricklaying and, in fact, surgery. But it comes into its own as a kind of as a interaction between engineering and psychology in the mid 1940s, when aircraft like this B-17 were crashing despite pilots being very, very experienced and well trained. And the story that the engineers told is, well, maybe this is too much. Maybe our planes nowadays are too much for a human to fly, that they become too complex for the human brain to deal with. But actually, when two psychologists, whose names I've forgotten, but anyway, two psychologists, Alphonse Trepanis and who was the other one? Started to explore the causes of this. They found that there was an issue with the design of these aircraft cockpits, which would allow pilots who were coming into land, who might want to select flaps and gear, but flaps first and then gear, they could easily switch, mistakenly drop the gear without dropping the flaps, which has an impact on the ability of an aircraft to fly when it's flying slowly. So the point here is that this wasn't a problem of human error. This was a problem of design that was creating the opportunities for an error to happen that would lead to a catastrophic outcome. So the answer becomes not one of trying harder or telling people to do something different, but designing the world such that it becomes apparent and easy to understand what's going on. So if you go onto an aircraft nowadays, you will see that the gear lever, the one that you use to drop the landing gear, is circular because it feels circular in your hand. For flaps, not actually, I think all flap controls are like this, but here is an example of flap control. It's flat. It's a big flat thing, so it feels very different. So this is the idea that you can build into the design of the world something about how you are supposed to interact with it, or what it tells you about the things that you're doing, that is putting knowledge in the world and not requiring knowledge in the head to do. And you can, through this design, invisibly guide people. As I said, this has also been used early on in studying surgery, which I came to much later, about 60 years after this, 70, 80 years. But in looking at in time and motion studies, around surgeons and how they performed within operating theatres. And these first-time motion studies by a guy called by a couple called Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, were some of the early scientific management people. They found that surgeons were spending more time looking for their instruments than they were operating, which is why we get to scrub nurses and the role that scrub nurses play in ensuring that the safety and efficiency of surgery. And so there are all these kind of hidden things that, we might not realize are there, and they serve a purpose, and that come from this way of thinking, not about the technical details of surgery or flying, but actually about the design of the world, whether that's the design of an aircraft cockpit or the design of a team or how they interact or the design of tasks that create these efficiencies and safety within them. So when we think about humans and their evolution, we didn't evolve. That technology has developed beyond the speed at which we evolve, and so we often find ourselves, set up for a world that might be, that might have been the world we evolved to exist in, 10,000 years ago, but that has sort of outpaced our evolution. And so we nowadays, a lot of us, sit at computer screens. We weren't necessarily, that's not how we designed ourselves or how we evolved. But at the center of every system is this amazing brain that's fabulous. And you have no idea how amazing it is. None of us do, actually. It's funny. And indeed, even though we have things like AI nowadays, it's not nearly as amazing as the brain. And won't be, in my view, for years and years and years. And I think actually the mistake that engineers make is to underestimate how amazing the brain is. It's why self-drive cars, for example, have been much more difficult to develop than the engineers promised us 10 years ago, because the brain does these amazing things that we don't always realize. It makes sense of the world in uncertainty. Machines are not very good at that. Machines are not very good at dealing with uncertainty. If you feed an AI with a new set of data that it's never experienced before, it can go haywire. And there's all sorts of interesting studies, by the way, in radiology around training detection of things within X-rays, but then you slightly change, the location of the X-ray or add something different, and the whole thing just doesn't work. So the brain is amazing, and it allows us to do these amazing things, including going up in the air and all of those things, right? It allows us to do these amazing things when we combine it with these different technologies, whether that's a surfboard or a motor car or a spacesuit or indeed a violin. So the combination of this amazing brain we have with the world we build around ourselves lets us do these amazing things. And so it kind of does this. It finds meaning and fine-tunes the senses, and we can do things automatically that make things very fast, easy to do. We can actually, the more expert you get at something, the less information you need to make an appropriate decision. But by the way, the more important getting these small pieces, sometimes of unknown pieces of information, take or of subtle cues, help us to make decisions. And it also means, for example, that humans are very good at making trade-offs. I can do something slowly and carefully, or I can do something fast, but potentially with more errors. When we run scientific studies, you tend to do in psychology, you tend to do a paradigm of either do this as fast as you can, or do this as accurately as you can. You can't kind of do both, because humans are very good at trading the one for the other. So what the human factors engineers do? Well, we help use these ways of thinking about psychology in the brain and how it works within these systems to understand how this combination of technology and people create outcomes, why people behave in the ways that they do, it uncovers these hidden complexities of the world around us and how our brains process it. It can often find new ways to look at new solutions to old problems. That's what I do in surgery. And thinking about how we balance it. It's also, by the way, about working with people and listening to them, and understanding the value of the humans in the system, and not seeing humans as the weak part of the system, but actually seeing humans and the human brain as this incredible strength that technology just doesn't have. Technology does things that the brain does, in other ways, and we can use technology, but actually, you always need people within a system. Okay. In fact, it's in design. This is an idea of, this is the sort of thing that you can start to think about when you start applying these principles. Which one of those dials would you turn to turn on that, to turn on the red hot plate there? It's it could be any one of them, and you tend to have these little pictures down the side that are very difficult to see. By the way, get rubbed off the more you clean it. But if you design it like that, it's actually much more difficult to make that mistake. It's very clear that, of how you would, operate that. So the idea here is that we can use this to design. Which phone would you choose? Phone 1 does calls, text, email, photos. Web, GPS, and has a 3-day battery life and costs $100. Phone 2 does calls, text, email, music, photo, web, GPS, has a 1-day battery life and costs $1,000. Which one are you going to pick? Because if you pick phone 1, based purely on the functionality, you can have my old Nokia N95. Because the new iPhone, when iPhones first came out, they were functionally less able than things like the Nokias that were out there. But what made them attractive and so much easier to use was the way in which we interact with them. By touching the screen and squeezing and all of the things that we know that actually don't take any training. And they've been superbly designed to be able to do that. So this is a difference between functionality and usability. So whenever you look at the functions of something, just understand that the user doesn't tell you anything about how easy it is to use or access those functions. The QWERTY keyboard is designed to slow you down so that in the old days when you had typewriters, they wouldn't jam. And there are other keyboard designs that you can use that are faster and more efficient, but actually it's so difficult transferring from QWERTY to these new designs. We're kind of stuck with, it's questionable whether the effort in everyone changing to new types of designs would actually be beneficial. But the point here is that it was originally designed to slow people down so that the typewriters didn't jam. So in fact, all the most well-used buttons are on the, keys are on the weaker hands, and anyway, all that kind of stuff. This is a bone injection device. Talked about this in every presentation. It's one of my favorite examples in healthcare. These are 2 different types of bone injection device. One is essentially a tube with a spring-loaded needle in it, and you use it to do it. Basically, it's an intraosseous. In other words, the spring loads or drills a needle into the bone to allow you to deliver sort of fluids and IV IV things that you would normally deliver IV if you can't get IV access. If you've got a patient who isn't easy to get IV access to. I came across the top one because I came for a resident who'd used one of these. He'd unwrapped it, put it down, had to check, how he was going to use it, picked it up, fired it off, and it got the wrong way around in his hand. And like on the Boeing on the B-17, it didn't feel different if it was one way or the other. And with a spring-loaded needle that is the wrong way in your hand, it went into his hand. And this individual said, well, I should have looked because it had an arrow on it, and I can't believe I did this. And I said, no, you were set up to fail. This is a design thing. Because the bottom one is a pistol grip, which you can't possibly make that mistake with. So the point here is that often we find things that people blame themselves for that actually could be easily solved through design if we take that step beyond what someone should have done to actually why they did it. So work as imagined, work as done is another key theme here, is understanding the complexity of work. When we sit in our offices or look at our data or think about what should happen, it seems so simple. But actually, the real world is remarkably complex. And in fact, it's very, very difficult to even sort of conceive of how concept things are until you go and see them. Work as imagined is this idea that the world is nice and simple and everything sort of, should go in the right way. Work as done is the messy realities of the imperfections in the world and the uncertainties in the world and all the things that create turbulence in our world. So this is an operating theatre. This is unlike any other any operating theatre I think we'd ever go in. It's how a device manufacturer might see an operating theatre. This is what this is a more cluttered version. This has got people in. And so these are all aspects of work as imagined versus work as done, and these are photos that we've taken from around the world in different hospitals of the messy reality of doing this sort of work. Just imagine having to pick through that. You're a sterile processing technician in a hospital who's receiving, and processing, tens of these trays every day, and having to pick through this big mass of sharps and blood and bone and clear everything off without injuring yourself. And of course, sharp injuries for sterile processing technicians are a big problem. In fact, one of the things we can work on with surgical teams is how they can reorganize their instruments before sending them down. So work as imagined, we have protocols. Well, those can't account for the eventualities. Saying somebody should have done something doesn't explain why they did it. What we like to think is what we do is evidence-based. Evidence isn't always that. There's lots of things that aren't evidence-based. Evidence is rare. It's debated. People don't change their behavior based on evidence. And it's socially constructed. What these people think is evidence is not necessarily what these people think is evidence. It's in the training. We know that training in the real world, there is a difference. And so just because somebody's trained doesn't mean that they're able to function in that world. You may have been trained and this is how you do it on this unit. Well, this is how we do it here, which is different. Or it's in the policy. Policies are unknowable. There are too many of them to know. Unknown. I didn't know there was a policy for that. Unavailable. I know there's a policy, but I can't get to it when I need to use it. Or unrealistic. It's a 30-page policy for a 5-minute job. Not to say that all of these things aren't valuable and can provide structure to an organization or to work, but that they're not, that following them rigidly is not the way work happens, because work and the world are messier than all of these things. So instead of thinking of sort of work as being, linear and deterministic, in other words, if we had a bad outcome, it must have mean something went wrong, and if we had a good outcome, it means something went right. In fact, most work, and the work certainly of clinical work, is complex and adaptive, which means that it's not easy to reduce, and that just because we had a bad outcome doesn't mean that something went wrong during that care, and just because we had a good outcome doesn't mean the care delivery wasn't a whole complete mess. So this incident, how am I doing for time? Oh, okay. Probably need to speed up. This is one of the worst incidents in UK medical legal history. A little girl was given brain damage through the mix-up of 2 syringes. And the natural response is to think, right, who did it? There was a sequence of errors. Why did this happen? Why couldn't they have done something different? And this is what they should have done to avoid it. All of these are natural responses, and they're not very useful. If syringes had been marked up, the hospital could see which contained dye and which contained glue, then Maisha would not have suffered what is an utterly devastating brain injury. Such easily avoidable mistakes should not happen. That's the sort of narrative that you get. And I'm here to tell you it's not very useful. These sorts of narratives are completely misleading because they're functioning from this idea that the world is nice and neat if only people did these small things. And so, you know, these are two aspects of cognitive bias. One is outcome bias, that this terrible thing that happened must mean that somebody did something terrible. When actually, it's the context in which this behavior happened that made it terrible. That swapping milk and juice in your kitchen, which is the same basic problem, doesn't create a dreadful brain damage. And hindsight bias is this thing looking back and saying, oh, well, they should have done it like this. So any investigation we do is always prone to hindsight bias, and we are naturally predisposed to have hindsight bias. We do this with our kids. Why couldn't you have just paid a little bit more attention when you were carrying that plate full of food? And now I've got to clean it up. But getting beyond that is going to help us understand what goes wrong. So given the advantage of a known outcome, what could have been a bewildering array of non-convergent events, in other words, all these different things that we're trying to avoid and navigate and do right all the time, that looking back, it makes sense that, oh, well, of course they should have done this. But when you're trying to avoid all these things out there that might create harm or things that can go wrong, it's not nearly as easy to see. So some of the consequences, and I probably need to skip this and move on, is, errors are only definable in retrospect. So error as being a description of a causation actually isn't a very useful thing. That a chain of events implies a false linearity. It's not a chain of events. When we look at that chain of events, we often stop at things that are abnormal or deviations from standard or politically acceptable as causes, and so we end up with unacceptable explanations for incidents, such as inattention or cognitive failure or loss of situational awareness. If you go beyond these ideas to why these things happen, it gives you a much better sense of what's going on. Okay, because I was working in that unit where that dreadful syringe mistake happened, and to cut a long story short, was working with that, observing this team and the challenges that they had to deal with every day. And during this surgery that I was observing, there was a very, very near mistake of two syringes getting swapped. One of Kyrocaine, which is this drug that if you comes into contact with the central nervous system is really bad, and saline. So, and in this case, the scrub nurse said, no, stop, don't do that. And there wasn't a mistake. So the point here is that you can look back and say, well, look at this dreadful thing. This was only about labeling syringes. Actually, this sort of thing is much more common than you might expect, and mostly does not lead to harm. And the world is a lot more complex than just this idea of labeling syringes. Okay, so a more useful way to think is, how did this seem reasonable at the time? What is it that led people to make the decisions that they made that led to harm? Because if you can work out that, then you have a better chance of understanding how to prevent it rather than telling somebody what they should have done after the fact. And so this is what we call reconstruction of the mindset, or the idea of walking in somebody else's shoes to understand the challenges that they've had in trying to do this work. And this is an example of an aximap, which I think we're going to hear more about, that is a great way to illustrate. And this is a sanitized version of a clinical event we had. And all the different things at all the different levels that contributed to this particular thing happening. It doesn't matter, the details don't matter. But what does matter is that it's not linear and it's happening at multiple different levels. And once you start to understand that, it gives you a much richer way to understand it and stop these things happening in the future than telling somebody that they should do something different. So error can be misleading, and I'm not going to go into all the details around this, just to say that these are all the ways in which the idea of error can be thoroughly misleading. And if you really want to learn a little bit more about this and why this has been very difficult for healthcare to sort of understand, this book, Still Not Safe, is a wonderful sort of history of the patient safety movement and also a critique of how there's been a failure to adopt this way of thinking within the US health system, or rather why it's been so difficult to move beyond the idea of error and focus on what the causes of harm really are. So I think I probably need, so this, for example, is all the ways in which anesthesia devices can go wrong, but which are usually labeled a cognitive error. When we have a bad anesthesia outcome, there is a tendency for clinicians to blame themselves and not see how they're set up to fail by all the ways in which these devices can fail. These are the different outcomes that an anaesthetist needs to balance when they deliver a drug. The patient, the family, the surgeon, their own colleagues, their own regulatory bodies, their own standards, the desires and financial constraints of and supplies of the organization. All these things don't coincide nice and neatly. So one aspect of expertise is being able to balance all these different outcomes to come to the best conclusion for this patient, with this team, with this surgeon, in this operating room, in this department today. So when we talk about, therefore, drugs errors, it's only we'll look back and say, well, I can't believe that they didn't balance all those things appropriately. But when we look forward and look at the complexity and all the things that are going into the decisions, we actually start to see how amazing it is that we do this effectively most of the time. So, this is a sort of narrative, and it's rubbish. It's absolutely, this kind of headline it's meaningless. Because if you want, you could probably measure 2,370 million errors if you take a different view of what error is. But error and harm are very different. We shouldn't be mistaking them. So the old view of error is that human error is seen as a cause of failure, but actually it reflects something more problematic about what's going on with the system. It may be satisfying to say human error was a cause, but actually it doesn't explain why people did what they did. And telling people to be more careful doesn't actually solve the problem, and we need to go deeper, and sometimes painfully deeper, into our organizations to understand what's creating the opportunities for errors to lead to harm. And so if we start thinking of the humans within our system as not this perfect system, if only people did everything right and follow the rules, then everything would be fine, but actually as the amazing people navigating all these complexities and all these uncertainties and all these imperfect systems to nevertheless deliver the care that they want to deliver, or all the other things, all the other things that we study, all the other outcomes we study, then we start to think of the value of the people within the system and what they're trying to do, and we can understand not blaming, but understanding how we can develop the world around them to make this job easier to do. So humans are a fundamental part of any system, and they create safety in complex systems. They're not the weak part of the system, and complex systems are inherently unsafe and require trade safety to be traded for other things, including efficiency and cost savings and volume and throughput. So Jim Reason, sort of father of human error, says we cannot change the human condition, but we can change the condition under which the human works, which is thinking about the brain within the system, how it interacts with the world, within a workspace and within an organization. So the simple thing is, who's doing it? What are they doing? What are they doing it with? Where are they doing it? And why are they doing it? And as soon as you start thinking in that way, rather than why did these do things wrong, you start to get at least 5 ways to solve the problem. So putting the people at the center of the system allows us to think about how to build the world in a different way, to give them more agency, to find deeper causes, to actually create error-resistant systems, not error-free systems, to value each other, to enhance their decision-making, to create work and devices that are intuitive, to amplify human abilities rather than constrain them, and to encourage better decision-making, trade-off, and systems thinking. So thank you so much.